Welcome back to the Disrupt Education Podcast. I'm Peter Hostrasser, along with Allie Privet, who jumps out of perfectly good airplanes. So before this, right, we were, I had no idea at one point you were hitting a storm brewing on the ground and it pushed you up instead of coming down. I'm going to guess you had a canopy open, right, when that
I
happened?
did, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, you want to unpack that for our listeners? Because I'm like, now
Well,
she's not only is she jumping out of perfectly good airplane, she's jumping into possible storms. I don't know what's happening.
not intentionally, I want to say like
Of
we
course.
do consider the weather. I want to put an asterisk out there because that like storm systems can pop up from when you literally get out of the plane to right, you have like 30 seconds to a minute of free fall depending on what altitude you go out, and then a canopy ride, depending on the size of the canopy and everything, can be like 5 to 10 minutes. And it also depends on like how high you deploy. There's like a lot of variables here. So um yes, I jumped into what was not it was on no radars, it was on no weather forecast, there was nothing was predicted, and I did end up, it was already under a canopy, and there was it was literally the front edge of the storm. So like there wasn't rain, the
Right.
lightning was like, miles and miles away, but sometimes storm fronts build 10, 20, 30 miles, and it was like all this heat was rising, and I was getting literally sucked into the sky for about 4 minutes. But it was a very odd experience to be like, I'm not descending, I'm still not descending, my canopy is just floating. And like paragliding, so
Yeah.
I don't do paragliding, but a lot of skydivers do. Well, so they look for updrafts,
Hmm.
they follow the birds in the sky, and they literally are trying to go up as high as they can to get the longest flight. Skydiving canopies aren't designed in the same way, so they don't like have all this, but it can happen, and it did
Yeah.
happen. Because the reason we're talking about this is our last guest, Dan Gonzalez, was
Hmm.
asking me about like, do I still get afraid? And like with skydiving, and yes, there it's always like new elements to the sport, and that challenge you and
Yep.
push you, and it's a continual learning process, which is why I love it. And it is all about like, I think my talking with Dan, he's so analytical and has this engineering brain. And it's so funny because he said like, I want to be an engineer, and then got the degree but then didn't use it. And I've said on the podcast multiple times that I think if I could go back in time, I would have been an engineer, but I didn't
Mhm.
even know what it was. And like, the thing with skydiving is it is continual problem solving. And I get to use kind of that more analytical, um, reverse design thinking, like not only on my own jumps, but with my students' jumps, like now getting to coach and instruct and be a tandem instructor. There's so many elements
Yeah.
to any one jump that I love the challenge of it. And I think if we're going to Dan's episode, like his District C is solving, like, maybe it's not a skydive problem in, the 30 to 60 seconds and then the 5 minute of free fall, but he is solving a critical problem. And for school districts that want to disrupt education, they want to do education differently, they want to set up students for the modern world. And District C is doing that work in a very, I think, needed way.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a great model. Like, we always are trying to find like models that we think those who listen to this podcast could jump on, or they
Right.
could take a piece and be like, oh, we could use that element, or like we could partner with like an organization like District C, we can make those changes. We hope that that is like one of our driving forces with the podcast and this series is letting people know there are organizations deeply invested in this work, and there are ways that are seemingly simple to disrupt education and really make big changes.
Yes, 100%. I think well, speaking of updrafts, I don't know if anybody knows this story that when my 16th birthday, I was in a glider in Colorado and we were looking for updrafts, so we couldn't really find that many. And the pilot said, "Do you like roller coasters?" And I was like, "Yes." And then about 5 minutes later, I woke up. So it was like he really basically I blacked out because he pulled so many G's, right? So, but I digress. Dan did not make us black out. He actually opened our eyes. I think one of the things that I really, really like about you just said it as well. I like the challenge, right? And I think
Hmm.
that's something that, as educators, as we go through this whole series, is kind of go back into nothing is actually going to be A to B. It's not going to be easy, right? You've gone well over 500 jumps. No two jumps are the same. We've all like taught hundreds, if not thousands, of students and worked with them. The no two are the same. um, Digging into that challenge, right? What is it that you really want to challenge, that is in your craft? And I think I wanted to start there after that story was a great story because, that was another challenge that came up. You're like, oh, wait, I'm in like an updraft. This is new. But I also, when we heard Dan talking about, I love a challenge, right? There's a problem, what we saw. So I think one of the main things, and we'll go deep into the weeds on District C here and kind of unpack it, but one of the main things that I want every educator, everybody who's like a lifelong learner listening to this, to think about is like find a place or something that you love to be challenged with and then just go. Like find
Hmm.
that, right? Don't just sit around and complain. Sitting around and complaining does nothing, right? Um, the pain of actually inaction should be more than the pain of wait, I don't know how it is. Like you need to
Action.
act, right? There was a really brilliant quote there, Ali, but I missed it. But like you really have to like find a challenge and dive into it. If you have a problem, like try to solve it. Try to have fun or find the right people to solve it. And that was just so refreshing because I mean, as an educator, and I know all our educators out there who have seen teamwork in a classroom, it is legitimately, and we said this on the last podcast, it's one person doing all the work. There's not a lot of cohesiveness. There are some programs out there, like the incubator program, who does some pretty good jobs with it. But in the end of the day, if you cannot work in a team and you cannot like listen to other people's kind of really lenses on things, you're not going to get anywhere fast. And
Yep.
that is something like in academics, it's so siloed, right? You can have a straight A, GPA. You can have a very high test score on an ACT or SAT. Can you work with people? Because you
Yep.
can get both those things without not being able to communicate that well and not being able to work with others. And that's something that I also wanted to take from that because that's something where we are missing things and Dan is fixing that. So I appreciate that.
I when I thinking about teamwork and teamship, so being a high school chemistry educator and being a lab-based course, we have experiments in lab time. And I remember being in high school and I was a good academic student and I would get partnered with, you know, whoever you'd get partnered with, it would be like for the semester or year potentially. And your lab partner so at the time when I was in high school, oftentimes you like wrote them together and like you did all the lab work together and like yes, you had to work with them, but there was no way to know like who did what
Right.
or and also like I didn't feel like the teacher at the time really thought about like the pairings and whatnot. I know from my evolution as an educator that I became like I spent a lot of my time thinking about the pairings and what students needed and coaching them, right? Like it comes down to this. His critical model is like based on coaching and shifting your perspective of what your role is in the classroom. And then of course providing the resources so that you can do that, right? You don't have to
Mhm.
worry about all the other things. But I remember I used to think that the best kind of teamships or partnerships in the lab was pairing like a high, quote unquote, higher, better communicative student with somebody that struggled And sometimes, I did think that was the right pairing because it would challenge the one to be a better communicator and the other one to see like, oh, this is a good work ethic. But I remember doing some more lab challenges where they were these inquiry-based experiences, and there wasn't necessarily a right answer, but you had to collect data and make sense of it. And I remember shifting my perspective into, okay, this was a little bit later. I knew my students, they'd had a couple touches in the lab, right? Like as Dan was talking about, more touches are better. And I actually found that like putting quote unquote like the best communicators together, I would get these really exceptional, like they didn't necessarily have to feel like they were carrying other people, right? So like I was trying to differentiate and move them forward. And then it wasn't like to try and like quote unquote punish students, but those that maybe struggled, like they didn't get an out. They were partnered with somebody else who maybe struggled so that they had to kind of look around and rise to the occasion. They couldn't lean on someone, right? Like I liked that. That was really the motivation was like, look, you can do this. I know that you would prefer someone else do it, right? And sometimes it was just as simple as like they didn't like manipulating the equipment. They
Hmm.
could do all the analysis, but if I put them with someone that would touch all of the equipment, they weren't getting that mechanical piece. And so like I had to really pay attention to my students and like what were they good at? What did they need to grow? And really focusing that lab time. I didn't care so much about the results and like it was all about the process and like, you know, your thinking behind what you did and what you saw. Like I got so probably like so far off from a traditional science teacher because I saw the role really in coaching the teams, coaching the lab experience to a higher level. Now,
Yeah.
of course, the next level is then taking those lab experiences outside of the classroom, right? Like as we're talking with Dan, I'm thinking, oh man, it'd be so cool to have like a chemistry capstone course for those that really love science and like want to see it outside of high school. Like it'd be so powerful. And you could really build that throughout the curriculum. And they get enough content that like if you're interested in it, you can go study it further in college. Now you need real world experience, which is exactly why we love what District C is doing and are
Yeah.
so glad that we got to have Dan on the podcast to showcase it.
And I feel it goes deeper than teamwork and communication. And as he was kind of going through that awesome. I mean, I really liked that story he was giving with the museum piece where, here's here's the problem, but it really wasn't. It was a symptom. And these kids actually went deeper and found that challenge and that problem. And there's a couple of things I want to unpack there. Number one is like, the more of these experiences are very, very important. And I'll go into that in a minute, but I think there's so many other, like, you have to make decisions, you have to communicate, you have to have cultural competence, you have to understand like reliability and flexibility in a team. So it's interesting because I really like he's focusing on the teamwork aspect of it, and that's kind of their shtick. But like, it really is so many more competencies and skills and durable skills that kind of go along with that. Point being is, I'm not sure if I ever shared this one on the podcast before. Maybe I have. I don't know. We've done over 350 of them, but it was the we had a team-based challenge that was going on in a school, and that two students were riding coattails, meaning they weren't really like doing much, and then one student had the presentation on presentation day, and that student didn't show up. And the people, I think I shared this before, but the people were there, the professionals were there when they had to give their pitch, and the two individuals who were kind of riding coattails were like, they were deathly afraid. They're like, what do I do, H? What do we do? And I'm like, you go. Like, they made their time. You got to go. And they scrambled and they made probably the worst presentation I've ever seen. But at the end of the day, they both walked out and they felt like they got kicked in the gut. And again, I asked them, I was like, please hold on to this feeling right now, because what you just learned was the most amazing lesson, and it was teamwork. Like you've got to be able to communicate with people. If you are not in the team and the team goes on the field and all of a sudden somebody gets injured and you're up, you've got to be ready. So you've got to participate. And they were like, man, we'll never forget this, right? So like those pieces need to come into play. There's got to be this uncomfortableness. And then I really like how Dan was like talking about, that there is challenge in here. It's muddy, right? There are these kind of, the teams will get together, and I know he didn't say it, but it happens when the presentation is not the best. But that's not a problem, right? We're not looking for perfection. I think the academic world is always looking for the right answer sometimes, but in the experiential world, you have to the opportunity is in the experience. Whether you win or lose, it doesn't matter. It's how you look at the game or the challenge that you were working with, and then how do you unpack it? Like what happened? What would you do better next time? And so that's what led up to these amazing group who was working in the museum. Is they've done it a couple of times. I love the repetitiveness of this, and I think that if you can build a school culture where there are these teams that are working in and across curriculum, where your people who are supporting you aren't only the people outside in the work world or the business world or organizations, but it's also a cross sector of history, science, math, business, art, music, all these different things. And I think that is a true disruption of education that is really going to set our next generation up for even more success.
I it literally is when I picture, disrupting education, it is programs and experiences like that. Like it we've talked about this on this series, right? I used to think it was this big bomb, but
Yeah.
it's really making school relevant. And I mean, your students that had that experience, the stakes were higher. The
Yeah.
stakes were higher because there were it wasn't just you,
Mm.
right? Like they had to present in front of people. Like I'm sure they will never forget that experience
Yeah.
because it they learned so many more lessons. And for me, I feel like the next step for those listening to the podcast who are doing this work, they're deep in the work, is like, how do we loosen policy at the local, state, federal level to give more flexibility for these types of programs to flourish, right? Like
Mhm.
we've spent a lot of 2024 talking with people basically deep in the work in all different areas. And it's like one of the things that all these people are working within this system, and they're disrupting it in their capacity, that they see a need and they're like solving the problem, just like Dan in District C is. But it's like, and there's more and more disruptors happening, and we love to see that. And it's like, make it easier for them,
Mhm.
right? Like if you're the superintendent, like make it easier for them. Like if you are someone in a school district, share this with a district leader so that they can be like, how can I make this easier? How can I make this work like grow? I think it's like we want to support that, on the podcast. And, you know, even the local school board can make so much impact by allowing these types of courses and things to happen, right? Like Dan did share some of and anybody in the system knows, like you're starting a new course and there it can be like politics even in like the local school district, and it's like we don't want that. We want to make it easy for students to have these experiences because everybody says that they're needed.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do an internship that's you're just checking the box for. Like if you're going to do it, you want it to be meaningful work. And there are organizations who know what meaningful work looks like and can help you. So, we always say like, and you say this all the time, right? Like, get out of the way of the students, let them do it. And it's like, get out of the way of the teachers and the educators and policymakers, get out of their way. Because if you want to prepare the next generation, you're gonna have to get rid of all of these quote unquote things you think students need to get a diploma and really focus on, like, I can't tell you how many times we've heard in this year that employers are looking for people who can communicate,
Hmm.
people who can work on a team. So it's like, do they really need to do all of the history, English, math, science standards that plague our educators, that they can't see how they could fit one more thing? Let's make it easier for them. That's what I see as like the next step in this,
Right.
is like, make it easier, get out of educators' way and curriculum, leaders' ways to like make these types of programs happen.
Right. I like the way that you're going into that. And I'm thinking as you're talking about, getting out of the way of things, I look on the business side of things as well. So organizations, et cetera. There are, I mean, I don't know if anybody out there knows that this is happening, but if you're a state, lawmaker, even federal lawmaker, especially around education, let's give tax benefits to people who are doing this. Like, if let's incentivize this. Let's incentivize this for businesses, and that incentivizing that is going to give them a little bit more of a push, right? If you have maybe some tax exemptions or whatever to allow for more of businesses, it could be small business, could be medium, large, international, whatever, to work with your community of students. That's got to be incentivized. So I think there's opportunities there as well. In what you were talking about as well, like when you have to hit these different standards and stuff. Again, I'm a business educator, so I'm not all that privy on a lot of those things because we're kind of on the outside of it. But I think you can also reimagine the way that these team-based challenges or these places that you can work with. I mean, even like, District C, where they're setting these things up, you can quote unquote check the box on a couple of those things. Maybe those units you have to cover or units of study or whatever it is through doing these challenges, and pulling down walls. I really think we, as educators, start to think about that. Take one unit, take one lesson out of one unit, and put together a quick problem. It doesn't have to be like a 4-week thing, but just start like playing around with it at a small level. And then once you get to the level that it's growing or whatever, you could like talk to obviously Dan in District C. But you can also, you can play around. And I think as educators, to get out of this kind of, we have a blinders on and we can't do this, we can't do this. Well, let's start trying some different things. One of the things that the best educators that I know, are the educators who are, it's okay to not like change, but just for the sake of change, but to challenge to do something better, right?
Mm.
That lesson, maybe if we get out of our own way and say, okay, if the lesson is me, maybe I'm spilling facts and then there's a test, right? So maybe if don't just look at, oh, maybe it's the way that I presented the facts, or maybe it's the way that, I maybe didn't use visual and I used audio or whatever. Maybe you may want to try using a professional somewhere and bring them into the classroom and then give the students a challenge that the lesson is going to unfold, or the learning goal or the target is going to unfold in that experience. I think we need to start, and Dan is a perfect person to kind of like walk you through that. But that's what our last podcast was all about. And this one is unpacking, like, how can we make experiences part of the assessments and the realization and the learning journey of students that fit into your curriculum, because it's there, right? Otherwise, we really wouldn't be teaching this curriculum, would we? I'm just
I don't
rolling
think
my eyes there for those who can't see.
for those who just listening, not watching on YouTube.
Yeah,
Yep.
right.
We're rolling our eyes at that one.
Yeah, you never know. So, yeah, what do you
So
think? What do you think?
the other thing I just want to highlight with Dan and many of our guests, because this series has been, like on, you know, this chicken or egg idea of like purpose and work and, does work create the purpose or does purpose create the work? And Dan's story is like, it starts off like, you know, I went to school, I became a teacher. I then, was doing tutoring to make extra money because I had these other passions. Oh, well, now I am working for a for-profit because maybe I can make more change there. And then I worked for Kaplan. And then, oh, actually, I'm going to just throw all of that like experience
Hmm.
and I'm going to start my own thing because I see a bigger need that I can help. And so many of the people who are like deeply invested in this work have stories like that start like that. And so for like those listening that are like on the cusp, like they're feeling this pull to like do something disruptive, that's your sign.
Yeah,
That's your sign, that you can like you can if you're feeling like I can solve this problem, I can do this thing, like you can. Like we really do want to empower you as the awesome listeners that you are to this podcast. Like we bring these guests to showcase like your route can change at any moment and you can make those changes and plant those seeds and all of your experience is moving you forward like that's just what's so cool about Dan's story and
hmm,
founding it with his wife and everything. Like
yeah.
we love that, and
He
now seeing like where it's going to go, incredible.
he engineered it, right? With his engineering degree. So yes, kind of to round this out, and thank you for that. Kind of like that really encapsulates our guest. We have one more guest,
Oh
and
yeah.
you got to think in threes. There are three it's going to be an incredible conversation. This guest is somebody who actually helped teach Allie and her profession now as a professional skydiver and skydiving instructor and tandem instructor and many, many more. So if you want to know what a true skydiving instructor's instructor, I guess, evaluator,
Hmm?
and I won't give you too much more information on this, uh, who also has a doctorate and also was a teacher at one point. This is going to be an amazing conversation. Dan nailed it when the experiences and how do we get students experience learning. Like all our other guests, kind of put together very awesome pieces that really are rounding this out. But I got to tell you, our last guest of this series is truly amazing. That's all I'll say.
Mm.
And you do not want to miss that. That'll be coming up next week. So for Allie Privet, I am Peter Hostrasser. I am on the ground. She's going to be jumping out of a plane again. And hopefully you guys don't run into any storms. But if you do, you'll know how to adjust. So I want to thank you all for hanging out with us on the Disrupt Education podcast. Remember, head us up. All our connects are on the notes. We'd love to connect with you. We've got a lot going on coming up in 2025. We're very, very excited. Take notes on all of these. I got to tell you, I have my notebook. I know Allie has hers. We have so much learning just by listening to this podcast. So appreciate that for all you who are on the ride with us. But we'll catch you next week. You don't want to miss it on the Disrupt Education podcast. We'll see you all later. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of the Disrupt Education podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Are you ready to disrupt the educational arena you're a part of? For more ways to get involved in the work we do here at Disrupt Education, check us out at disrupteducation.co. or find us on LinkedIn at Peter Hostrasser or Allie Privet.
Our mission here is to help facilitate and amplify changes in the educational system through local initiatives and help you scale them into community movements. Our building network of disruptors in education are working to move beyond scores and grades as the only measure for student learning. If your school district, college, campus, or organization is looking for facilitators of this work, reach out on our website or social media.
And if you have any thoughts or feedback on this week's episode or any episode, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries, taking risks, and most importantly, disrupting education.